welcome to this edition of Your Notes, starring me, Mr. Parrot. Today's topic is going to be on protists, our tiny unicellular beings that don't quite fit into any of our categories of life, so we kind of made up our own division of them. So what a protist actually is, it's a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic, meaning that it has a nucleus in there. And basically what these are is that these are organisms that are eukaryotes that aren't animals, they aren't plants, and they aren't fungi. And that's basically what defines a protist. It's considered basically the junk drawer of the eukaryotic domain there. Because it's everything that everything is not. Now, some of the structures that are part of all protists is that they are eukaryotic, meaning that they have a nucleus a part of them. So they're most likely unicellular, but there are some multicellular examples as well, mostly in the form of seaweed and kelp. But most of our protists that we'll take a look at are unicellular, meaning that we're going to have to also see them underneath the microscope as well. Now, they get their food by either being autotrophs or heterotrophs, and it depends on what type you are. If you're more animal-like or fungus-like, you're going to be a heterotroph. If you're more plant-like, you're going to be an autotroph. Now, we divide them up into our three different divisions. Those three divisions would be the ones that are more like animals, the ones that are more like plants, and the ones that are more like fungus. Over the next couple of slides here, we're going to look at each different one of those in its own separate category. First, looking at animal-like protists. Now, with our first section, we're going to look at animal-like protists. Now, how do they get their food? Much like us as animals, they're going to get their food by eating others, so they're going to be a heterotrophs. Now, typically, we don't always call them animal-like protists because that's just going to get too long, and we're scientists. We can come up with another name to figure out how to call them. So we can also call them protozoans, where the word at the end there, zoa, is Latin for zoo, which is Latin for animal. So they're protozoans, so they're little animals in those cases. And they're going to be classified into 4 different categories based upon how they move. And for each one of these categories, I'm going to show you a picture of it while I talk about each one of them. We have our pseudopods, or otherwise known as sarcodines, or sarcodines. We have our ciliates. We're going to have our flagellates, and we're going to have our parasitics. Alright, so how these protozoans are classified is by their movement. Our first category is our sarcodines, or our pseudopods, and how they actually move is through what is a pseudopod themselves. What a pseudopod is just an extension of the cell that kind of lunges out forward and then pulls the rest of itself to it. And they move very slowly. Now, as a part of all of these protozoans is also something that's called a contractile vacuole, which collects water, much like a normal vacuole does, but what they do is that they expel all the extra water that they end up collecting, because all these protozoans are spending most of their time in water, so they're going to collect too much water for their cells to handle. Now, the second thing that's a part of our grouping is what's called a ciliate. Now, a ciliate moves through cilia, which is little tiny hairs all over the outside of the protozoa. And these hair-like projections make it move in a rowing fashion. So picture a rowboat, and they row as a rowboat. So they go a little bit faster. And these guys are constantly going, so like, they're going to be constantly moving in their wave-like fashion, back and forth, 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 back and forth. The third category is a flagellate. Now, they have flagella, which we've already kind of talked about as well. These are long whip-like appendages. So as they're moving, they're going to be whipping them out. Kind of think of like your feet paddling in the water. They're just going to be kicking about. That's flagellates. Now, the last one isn't really based on a movement style, but it's still going to be something that's grouped into, and these are our parasitic protozoa. And how they move is that they rely on their host, because as parasites, they feed on the cells inside of our body. So they feed on the fluids and the host of them, whether they move or not. They're still going to move with the host. Now our second group is our plant-like protists, or these are normally called algae. That green stuff that's sometimes on like your pool, or even on like a lake that you'll see. The green stuff on top of it, that's typically algae. They get their food by being autotrophs, which means they get it from the sun. And they're good in the environment because they produce a lot of our oxygen. Now, algae are divided into 6 different categories, or there's 6 different groups of them that the book talks about. We'll go through each one and present a little fact about each one of them. Our first one is what's called diatoms. And what's special about them is that they have a very glass-like appearance to their cell wall, so they're easily seen through. And they also glide on this slime that they produce that lets them just slide along. We then have dinoflagellates, which is another type of algae, which cool thing about them is that they glow in the dark. Some of them have different proteins that allow themselves to be capture the sunlight, and when all the darkness goes away, the sunlight then that captured sunlight then gets shown as being glowing in the dark. We then have euglenoids, or euglena as it's typically called. And a weird thing about these guys is that since they're protists, sometimes they can be heterotrophic, even though they're still going to do photosynthesis. Sometimes underneath the right conditions, they'll nom 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 and chomp up other ones. We then have our different types of algae based on their color. We have red algae, which is like your multicellular seaweed, and it's got a nice red color to it. We then have green algae, which contains the same type of chlorophyll as our plants do. So it's very similar to our plants. It's the closest relative to the plants are these type of protists there. And then we have our brown algae. This is the most, it's got a lot of similar characteristics to plants as well, and these are most often the type of seaweed or kelp that you come across. They have very similar type of appearances. It looks like they have leaves to them, stalks, roots, but they're not. They're different, but they have a brown color to them. Our final category is going to be our fungus-like protists, and these are typically called molds. So when you're talking about a mold, it's probably because of a protist and not actually a fungus itself. How do they get their food? They're heterotrophs, just like our fungus will be, which means they're going to decompose their food, which means they absorb it into their bodies or into their cells. Now, how do they reproduce? They reproduce by a structure called a spore, which you can kind of think of as a seed in some way, shape, or form. But it's not quite a seed, because plants do seeds. But what a spore is a tiny little cell that can grow into a new organism. So it's just one cell that can eventually, underneath the right conditions, grow into, the whatever it needs to. In this case, a fungus-like protist, a mold. Now there's 3 groups of molds. We have a slime mold, which come in a variety of colors. And typically you find these out in the woods somewhere. You have then your water molds. These are usually found in moist places where water just seems to collect. Most often you'll see this mold as damage that can happen in your house. If your house floods and you don't clean up all that flooded water, or it soaks into like your carpet, typically the water mold is what's going to be happening. And then last but not least, we have our downy molds, which this is the type of mold that's going to most often attack our crops. you'll see it appear on leaves, fuzzy stuff on leaves. That's going to be this downy mold. Typically on the back side, because that's where all the moisture is going to collect. Thank you for watching our videos, and hopefully you have your notes completed for tomorrow, as there's going to be a note quiz check like we typically been doing with some of these. There will be one of those tomorrow over our different types of protists. So hopefully you've got yourself prepared.